It's 8:30. I think we're going to just let's wait one more minute and then we'll get started. Well, welcome everybody. I know that people are still getting on, but we wanted to get started because we do have limited time with quite a bit to cover. My name is Diane Mathis-Durfey, and I'm a partner here at Holland & Hart's International Group, and will be moderating today's discussion on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This webinar is being recorded. By way of background, I started my practice in Moscow in the early 1990s and just after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I would like to say that I'm pleased to be here speaking about the region, which obviously holds a special place in my heart. But as with the rest of you, I'm confident that we all wish we were here under different circumstances today. I'm going to start by providing a brief introduction on our panelists, and then we will have a more focused discussion on the US sanctions, and then we'll engage in a question and answer session. So for those of you on the call, if you have questions that you have not been able to get to us before this webinar, feel free to do so in the Q&A chat. Gwen Green is with us today. She's based out of our Washington, D.C. office. She advises on laws and regulations affecting international trade and business, including the International Traffic in Arms Regulation, Export Administration Regulations, U.S. sanctions administered by OFAC, laws governing the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. A significant part of Gwen's practice involves internal investigations, voluntary disclosures, and compliance program reviews. We're very pleased to have Gwen's expertise here. Matthew Cavara joins us from the Denver office. Matthew has more than 20 years of experience advising on international technology-related transactions. He works regularly with clients involving technology, sales channels, outsourcing, software licensing, and procurement agreements, and has experience across several countries in Europe, Asia, the Pacific, as well as North and South America. Prior to joining Holland & Hart, he led an international legal division for a publicly traded company and also has experience as general counsel for a SaaS company. So we're pleased to have Matthew here with his broad in-house and international outside counsel experience. Dave Glynn joins us, another seasoned veteran in the international space. He has more than 16 years experience counseling clients and conducting detailed internal investigations and audits on U.S. export controls, trade sanctions, and import compliance matters. Prior to joining Holland & Hart, he worked in-house in various import and export compliance roles and is a licensed U.S. customs broker. And finally, we have Anton Sergeyevich Kraney, an attorney based also out of our Denver office. This conflict is close to home for Anton. He was born to Russian and Ukrainian parents in Moldova and ended up fleeing to the United States in 1997 with his family after escaping anti-Russian persecution by the Moldovan nationalist movement. Before going to law school, he graduated with honors from Tulane University with dual majors in international relations and Russian, where he completed a thesis on Russian foreign interventions from the dissolution of the Soviet Union through 2016, a large portion of that thesis focused on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. He also has an international public law certification from the Hague Academy of International Law. So we are excited to have Anton here with his unique perspective on this conflict and on the region generally. A very distinguished group of international attorneys that I'm very pleased to be working with here at Holland and Hart. So with that introduction, Gwen, I'd like to turn the time over to you to maybe give us an overview of the sanctions and the actions being taken by the US government in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you, Diane, and good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us. I wanted to begin with a high-level overview of the flurry of sanctions that we saw the U.S. government impose over the last week. There were a lot, and it seemed almost hourly, but I did want to start off by just providing a high-level overview of what we saw over the last week. First, we saw a series of designations to the specially designated nationals and block persons lists of banks that previously were subject to sectoral sanctions or previously weren't sanctioned at all, including Russia's second largest bank, the VTB Bank, and 20 of its subsidiaries. These new sanctions on Russia's banking and financial institutions actually account for about 80% of all banking assets in Russia. So these new sanctions and designations will significantly impact payment flows in and out of Russia. OFAC also provided several general licenses, which among other things, provided a 30-day wind down period for certain transactions involving some of these sanctioned banks, including VTB. OFAC also provided general licenses allowing certain energy-related transactions related to payments through June 24th of this year with some of the sanctioned Russian banks. There were also general licenses related to specific bonds, debt, and transactions related to agricultural commodities, medicine, and medical equipment exported to Russia. In addition to these SDN list additions, OFAC targeted Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, with sanctions. Sberbank is, at least for now, not an SDN, but effective March 26th, Sberbank will no longer have access to U.S. correspondent accounts. This means Sberbank will no longer be allowed to engage in U.S. dollar transactions, which will impact its ability to do business internationally, given the strong role of the dollar, the U.S. dollar. We also saw several additional sectoral sanctions by OFAC, which now impose prohibitions on U.S. persons from providing new debt of greater than 14 days maturity and new equity to a number of Russian state-owned entities, including Sberbank, Gazprom, Transneft, and the Russian railways, among others. These new sanctions, these particular sanctions, were pursuant to Directive 3 to Executive Order 14024. The new sanctions also prohibit U.S. financial institutions from participating in the secondary market for bonds issued by the Central Bank of Russia, its National Wealth Fund, and Russia's Ministry of Finance after March 1st, so after yesterday. In addition, the government has sanctioned several high-level government officials in Russia, including Putin and the Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, and also several Russian oligarchs. Most likely, we will very well see additional targeted designations of other significant Russia political, military, and economic actors in the coming days and weeks. And we've also seen our allies take very similar actions with respect to Russian banks as well as the Russian government officials. Finally, with respect to the sanctions, the US government did not limit its sanctions actions to just Russia. Several Belarusian entities and individuals have also been sanctioned in response to Belarus's role in the invasion of Ukraine. These sanctions focus primarily on two sectors of the Belarusian economy, namely financial institutions and the defense sector. We also saw, similar to the embargo the US has on the Crimea region of Ukraine, the US has imposed an embargo on the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. These prohibitions include a prohibition on the importation into the United States, rather directly or indirectly, of goods, services, or technology from Donetsk or Luhansk, and also a prohibition on the exportation, re-exportation, sell, or supply, also directly or indirectly, from the US or by a US person, wherever located, of any goods, services, or technology to those regions. We've also seen many more restrictions come out on the export control front by the Department of Commerce, including expanded restrictions on tech exports to Russia. We've received quite a number of questions from clients with respect to the expansion of BIS's licensing policy. In particular, as of February 24th, BIS now requires a license to export, re-export, or transfer products, software, and technology controlled on the Commerce Control List in categories 3 through 9 to Russia. These restrictions expand license requirements to a much broader array of items, including microelectronics, telecommunication items, sensors, navigation equipment, avionic equipment, marine equipment, and civil aircraft. These new restrictions have significantly expanded the de minimis rule for products destined to Russia, as now these items controlled in categories 3 through 9 on the CCL, the Commerce Control List, will now have to be taken into consideration as controlled content in any de minimis calculation. Notably, the new restrictions do provide an exclusion for deemed exports and deemed re-exports. This is important given that if a company employs a Russian national employee in the United States, for example, they would not be subject to the same new licensing requirement for sharing control technology with such employees that they would be required if they were to export the same technology to Russia. BIS estimates that these new expansion and new controls will result in an additional 350 license applications being submitted to BIS annually. Now, these license applications do not necessarily mean you will be approved and authorized to make such exports, because the new licensing policy with respect to these new controls will be subject to a presumption of denial with very limited exceptions. And these exceptions, generally speaking, means that there will be a case-by-case review for applications related to the safety of flight, maritime safety, humanitarian needs, government space cooperation, civil telecommunications infrastructure, government-to-government activities, and certain limited operations of partner country companies in Russia. Applications for wholly owned U.S. subsidiaries, as well as foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies that are joint ventures with other U.S. companies, or wholly owned subsidiaries and joint ventures of companies from our partner countries, will be also reviewed on a case-by-case basis. But this doesn't mean that if you are such as a U.S. subsidiary that you can proceed without first seeking approval. You will have to still seek approval and apply for a license from BIS. And with that case-by-case review, it still does not guarantee your license application will be approved. You just have a slightly better chance than if you did not fall in those limited exceptions. And Dave, I would say that, over the last week, we've received quite a number of questions from companies trying to understand this expansion, because now certain products of theirs are now subject to this new licensing regime.
Exactly, Gwen. And I think what companies need to recognize is that there are now a lot of products that previously did not require a license at all, or could go under what we call license exception, where you wouldn't have to apply for an individual license from the Commerce Department and wait your months maybe to get the license. You could ship immediately. They're self-executing. Those are no longer available to Russia. And items, just ran into it with a client yesterday with an item that was what we call no license required. It could ship to Russia as long as the end user was not listed. It could ship there with no license. Now today, there's a license requirement for that. There's a requirement to submit an application and to wait until that application is reviewed and approved. The 350 estimate of new licenses, I think, is probably low. Time will bear that out. But I think what you're going to see is if you have any sort of shipment, even to a commercial customer in Russia in the next 6 months, probably at least, there are going to be significant delays in getting approval to make those exports. So this is a major change that we haven't seen in any recent time, that such severe sanctions on exports have been put in place.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. With we've seen several conflicts around the world, and we've seen sanctions come and go. And just your thoughts on the impact of these sanctions and the unusual nature. At least someone who's not in as deeply at the space as you are, I'm interested in your thoughts on the actions that the U.S. has taken so quickly, and also it seems the collaboration with some of its allies that feels a little unusual compared to other countries that we've seen sanctioned in the past.
I think what's also very unusual with this is that it's not just the U.S. taking this unilateral action. As you said, we're doing this in coordination with our allies. But this does further complicate things for companies who have global operation in our allied countries, because you're not just having to get up to speed in what the U.S. has done. You also have to make sure your team has a handle on the similar actions, but some different with respect to what's going on in our allied partner countries. Some of the new controls and sanctions that have been imposed specifically will carve out certain exceptions if you're in those partner countries, but the U.S. has done so because those same partner countries have already instituted similar provisions or plan to implement similar provisions that you'll have to abide by. So it further complicates it, and it adds a wide, array of items that, as Dave said, normally could have been shipped to Russia as no license required or under a license exception. And now companies have to rethink and reevaluate their compliance procedures that they already had in place, and certain stops and checks that they had in place to make sure they had all of their license in place that were required. Now there's a whole slew of their products that now may be subject to this new license regime, and there's no guarantee that if you submit the application, your license will be approved.
Which raises the question: if you are a company that is doing business with Russia or Belarus, what immediate steps can companies now take, or should they be taking? What things should they be thinking about to try to mitigate the sanctions and the export compliance risks that they have Thoughts on that?
I would say that it's really the most immediate step that you can do is to conduct due diligence on all operations and counterparties to determine where your Russian and Belarus touch points exist. And think about alternative or backup operations in the face that maybe, you know, you're not subject specifically to sanctions because of your parties, your counterparties, but there is a chance maybe in the future there could be because of the touch point to Russia and Belarus. It's now time to start thinking about those specific, you know, alternative backup operations. And also reviewing the existing compliance policies that you already have in place and those procedures to make sure that they align with new restrictions. There, you know, things are happening and are very fluid. So it is right now we're all drinking through a water hose, but use those compliance policies and procedures that you already have in place and look for areas in those policies and procedures where you need to revise or strengthen or make it more robust to make sure that you do in fact align with the new restrictions. And I'm sure there's others that you have in mind too.
One thing to add to that, Gwen, that I think should be done immediately for any company, Directive 3 under the OFAC sanctions on Russia could have a major impact because it has limited the new debt down to 14 days. And OFAC considers new debt to be payment terms. So when you're thinking about billing a client, customer in Russia, you know, if you happen to have one of those parties that's named on Directive 3 list, you may not extend terms beyond 14 days. You must be paid in 14 days. So think about that. I have companies also going through that process to make sure that their payment terms are sufficient, that that they don't run into that problem. If more companies get named to Directive 3, it's somewhat limited now, but we expect more to be you know, added to that list. And the idea is we're trying to, you know, turn up the pressure on the Russian economy. And I think you're going to see more of that. And the 14-day term is very strict, and OFAC doesn't enforce it. So be aware of that as you come through. And I also agree that looking at your network, right? So if you think maybe that you could shift your fulfillment from the U.S. Going to Russia to Europe, that may not work. And Gwen explained a little bit about the de minimis rules, but what they really mean is if you have some U.S. content in your foreign-made products, they may be subject to these same rules, even though they're made in a foreign country. So you need to be aware that that could impact if you think you could start switching fulfillment or supplier sources. You may run into trouble there that you'd want to do some additional due diligence.
Interesting. Let's switch for a moment and talk about supply chain issues. Anyone in the international space, we have been grappling with significant supply chain problems that were spurred on because of the pandemic. They have not lessened. Anton, I'd like to just start with you, and maybe if you could give us a little bit of color about the industries in the region, and then we could open it up to all the panelists to just talk a little bit about what we anticipate from the supply chain and what steps that companies operating in the region or even just globally should be thinking about and taking in order to mitigate some of those risks related to that additional strain.
Yeah, so typically the thing we're most familiar with when it comes to Russian exports is oil and natural gas, and that is their largest export. So we saw a lot of things related to that, even the previous Ukrainian crisis with the agreement that allowed for the pipeline to reopen that goes to Europe. But there's also certain luxury goods, particularly precious metals that Russia exports a lot of. Russia also does a lot of wood or treated lumber, I think is the word, but wood exports, and then iron as well. So mostly heavier industries, with the exception of certain precious metals, diamonds as well. But the largest effect predominantly is going to be in natural gas and oil. And some of the Russian, some of the other countries, there, Belarus, their trading is almost, I think, 70 or 80% with Russia within that region, but they deal in, there's a little bit of natural gas trading there as well, but most of the other goods go directly to Russia. Dried fish is another one, but I'm not sure that has as big of a role internationally.
And aside from the sanctions and limits with Russia, obviously it seems that there could be some impact just from Ukraine because of the difficulty that is there in the country being able to deal with the products that they have, which I think are more agricultural. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Ukraine was always, even in the Soviet Union, the heartland of that region. So they trade a lot in grain, cereals, animal, vegetable oils. They also do a lot of iron and steel trading as well. Obviously, I think that market is dominated more by Russia in that region, but we also have to keep in mind that a lot of this trade was going back and forth between Russia and Ukraine. So that's something also to think about when we're considering some of these export statistics. It's a little bit difficult to really surmise which ones went out to Europe and which ones went specifically out to Russia. There's some statistics on it, but just something to keep in mind when we're considering the largest exports.
So thoughts from the panelists on steps that companies can take maybe to mitigate some of these risks and the difficulties that are already there and will just appear to be exacerbated from this situation.
Yeah, Diane, I think like many of us at an individual level, we're processing this conflict and how to work through it. We're finding companies are at different stages in their processing. I just spoke to a CEO this morning who got his last expat out of Ukraine and still has lots of staff who either are unwilling or unable to leave Ukraine. So, they have not moved to kind of the next step. Then there's other clients who may be further along. And as Gwen, put forth, I think it's smart to game and regame those contingency plans, especially for your supply chain. If you anticipate that you may be in breach of some of your agreements, or if your suppliers are going to be in breach, look at some of the provisions in those contracts which may be key. Is there a hell or high water clause? Is there a force majeure? What extent do you need to, what steps do you need to take as a company in order to preserve your rights to claim an excuse? Whether that be impossibility of performance or something under the force majeure provision. As you, think about the foreign exchange issues that may be impacting your company and whether you need to readjust payment terms or the types of currency which you're accepting. I'm hearing questions about whether cryptocurrency might be an acceptable form of payment for some of our clients, and they're wrestling with those issues as well as beyond just asking the very specific questions to Gwen and Dave about what are the implications of the latest sanctions, but do we need to go a step beyond? Is there an ethical responsibility based upon the nature of our company? So these are all different issues at different phases where individuals are struggling, but I think gaming out contingency plans, looking if you're heavily tech dependent, as most companies are these days, anticipating that there could be cyber interruptions. So dust off the DRP, your disaster recovery plan with respect to technology. Maybe it would be prudent to put it through a stress test, test those processes, test alternatives that you might have, and not become complacent simply because you feel like you've got things taken care of or you're not as integrated into the region. Certainly this conflict could escalate and it could move to other jurisdictions, and so gaming those out would be smart.
So the cryptocurrency issue, I think, is an interesting one. I'm interested in thoughts from Dave and Gwen on how the U.S. government is thinking about crypto, if at all, and how that plays into the sanctions. Obviously, if you're on one of the lists, you're blocked and you should not be doing any kind of business. But for others, is this a way around the effect of the sanctions?
But one of the things that the U.S., even though the U.S. may not have fully thought through the crypto issue, the sanction provisions all include the provision regarding evading sanctions or taking steps to try to evade sanctions. So the U.S. government would see any workaround using cryptocurrency to do an activity or engage in a transaction that you would otherwise be prohibited to do in US dollars as you attempting to evade US sanctions. So you would still be deemed on that. The sanctions provisions also include facilitation provisions. You are prohibited from facilitating transactions with sanctions persons or with sanctioned regions. So the US government, even though it understands itself that it doesn't always it's not as quick in taking into account certain technologies and certain changes in our financial structures, but it has these provisions that will nevertheless account for the fact of any attempts to try to circumvent any sanctions.
One additional comment there that OFAC is, the Treasury Department is on top of this, in that the example of Venezuela, the Venezuelan sanctions, they actually came out and said, hey, the Venezuela cryptocurrency that they developed would be subject to the sanctions as well. So we could see something expanding there, maybe not to one of the more internationally, I guess, traded, if you will, cryptocurrencies, but there could be some other sanctions that could come along if they see that there's being some evasion. And I think there's enough hooks in the OFAC sanctions that they can still get a party if you try to use Bitcoin to do that, if it's, or whatever cryptocurrency, if there's traceability of some sort, which is, I think, difficult, right? That's the difficult part about it, or the good part about it, right? It's not traceable.
Depending on who you ask.
Do you have a sense of what additional sanctions are coming? We know as this started, we've seen, sanctions adding on to additional sanctions and restrictions. Is there any sense of where this is going and where we're going to end up?
I think a lot of this is very heavily dependent on the next steps the next actions that Russia takes with respect to Ukraine. The situation is very fluid. I think we should all anticipate that the US, the EU, the UK, and our partner countries will continue to add sanctions on Russia in the occupied territories. And, we may even see additional sanctions similar to what we see with respect to those targeted sanctions on Belarus, if the US and the partner countries determine there is any other country or other actors who are providing support to Russia's effort. I think we will also see, because we've already seen calls from members of Congress for harsher sanctions on Russia, and that they should be ratcheted and there should be more restrictions on Russia. So I think we will likely see some movement in Congress on that score. The timing of that is unclear, but we've already seen so many calls that I think that there are some congressional members and senators who have things in works. When those will actually come to the floor or go to the committees, that's up in the air, but we will see more movement on, at least in the US, on the congressional front as well.
And that raises a question that one of our clients had posed, which is, what is the possible impact to trading with China or other countries supporting Russia? If you have any thoughts on that, some of the secondary markets or other parties around the world.
Yeah, Diane, I think that's an interesting question in that we don't know yet. I don't know that we've had countries come out and actually fully support Russia and what they're doing, maybe North Korea, but they're pretty well isolated already. China, I guess, recently came out and they're hedging, right? They're not supporting, they're not against, so they're kind of in the middle. And I think that's the big trading partner that we're all worried about in terms of, if they would be sanctioned in some way. I think it's feasible if they started supporting, especially militarily, you know, financial, supported the Russians in this. So I think that's something to watch out for. But we're also seeing some other kind of effects, particularly in the supply chain, with you know, carriers now. FedEx and UPS have suspended shipments into Russia and Ukraine. Things like that, not flying over Russian airspace is creating a problem. I think that companies need to look at, because we're seeing delays now. There'll be obviously bigger delays in deliveries and the logistics system. So I think things like that could happen even if we don't see a sanction necessarily on a third country. We're going to see these other effects. It's affecting ocean shipping as well if you're doing that. So it's starting to affect other areas, and just the uncertainty is causing so much disruption in the network that it may not take sanctions to really disrupt your supply chain. It may happen through what's already in place. It may not take further sanctions. So I think that's the piece of looking at your network and really understanding where you're shipping and who you're dealing with.
Yeah, and the uncertainty of it all, I think is something that's very hard to grapple with when you're trying to make decisions, strategic decisions, business decisions. That's challenging. Matthew, I'm interested in your thoughts on advice that you've been giving to clients in this area, just the added uncertainty and what some of the, particularly with your in-house experience and your business experience working in the international space, what is the advice that you would give to clients based on this additional uncertainty arising from the conflict, not knowing how long it's going to go, not knowing how long or what additional sanctions we're going to be seeing, and things that you should be doing or looking at as a business owner to mitigate some of these risks?
Yeah, I don't believe my advice has really altered or changed that much, either as a result of the pandemic or the latest conflict. I sort of see it as our role to think about worst case scenarios. They can arise in all sorts of circumstances, and many of them we can't think all the hypotheticals. But those hypotheticals, certainly our clients are more attuned and attentive to those issues, where I used to see eyes glazed over as I would talk through force majeure provisions or foreign exchange concerns. Now they're asking me the questions and getting into real detailed arguments or discussions, I should say, and deliberations about what's being prudent. So a bit more attentiveness to those types of provisions. If you're either on the supply side or the purchasing side, you'll want to look at those compliance with law provisions and where those risks are shifted and how those risks are shifted. Because in this landscape, that may affect your pricing, and it may also impact violations and who's responsible. So helping to keep your nose clean. So those are the areas where I'm seeing just a little bit more attentiveness to the issues, but I do think these are provisions that have been, longstanding, and there's been conflict in the world before. Maybe a bit of complacency, a little bit more, and I don't discourage accepting risk. Just do so with your eyes wide open as to what risk you are accepting.
Yeah, and we've seen an increased number of countries pulling out of Russia fairly early on. BP and Shell have announced they're going to be divesting of their investments in the region. Apple, Disney, and Ford are scaling back. And I think that raises the question, if you're in one of these jurisdictions, are you staying? Is it time to be thinking about leaving the area? We know that there's been previous conflicts in the past between Russia and former Soviet states. Several have resolved. We've had some of these with sanctions, some with trade restrictions. And Anton, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Is it worth adjusting your international market strategies right now for the future in this region? Or with what you're familiar with in this region, are you thinking, weather the storm? It's gonna pass, and what are your thoughts?
I would really love to be able to confidently say the latter, but I really don't see that happening. It's true there have been several other conflicts in this region. There's the Transnistrian War, the Russo-Georgian War, for the prior conflict, and the war on Donbass, and those were resolved. I guess clearly some of them went not totally resolved because we're having resurgences now, but we have to keep in mind that there are several things that have happened that make this, a really new or just an unprecedented event, right? This is the largest occupation of a sovereign nation since World War II. This is the first time this NATO peacekeeping force, I can't remember exactly the name, was sent into a country. The first time the EU has provided military aid to a nation in defense of its, borders. And I'm not sure that this is, going to follow in the footsteps of the former conflicts. There's also civilians being armed. There's just so many layers to this that make it unique and that make it kind of a much bigger deal. And I'm not sure that a conflict in which, the nation being attacked is recruiting its civilians to fight and have this kind of guerrilla war as the US has experienced previously. Those don't last, 3 years. Those don't last, a couple months. That stretches out for a long period of time. There's also other nations that have diaspora Russians and have had issues. Moldova is one that has a breakaway republic. And so if I was to put money on if there was another nation that Russia would potentially try something similar in, it would be Moldova, where they already have kind of a stronghold. And this is just kind of, not to have a super pessimistic viewpoint, but, there are massive companies. Apple was another one, right? ExxonMobil is another one that have left. These are massive companies that are adjusting the international market strategy. And so if they've decided that they need to shift away from this, I think that's also a pretty good indicator, right? That, this isn't shaping up to be a quick set of sanctions and then, okay, everything's fine. So yeah, I would definitely say this isn't a situation in which you can just kind of hold tight and hope things resolve themselves.
David and Gwen, do you have some additional thoughts on this, of kind of the long-term impact and strategy, and whether it's feasible for companies to be able to continue operating in the region, or are they looking at pretty seriously now at possibly moving out or significantly changing strategies?
I think companies, they recognize, as we've seen with BP and Shell and now Apple, they recognize that there's not only the potential exposure to sanctions and export control risks, but there's also reputational risks right now. If you stay the course and you're seen as supporting supporting Russia and de facto supporting its actions against Ukraine, it can have, significant implications to your reputation. And a lot of companies do not want to risk that. So that, coupled with the exposure to not only the sanctions that have already come out over the last week, but the prospect of additional sanctions and additional export restrictions, it has made it very difficult for companies to continue their marketing strategy in Russia. And that's the reason why you're seeing such large companies with a lot of money, especially you look at the oil and gas companies, Shell and BP, they have billions of dollars involved in Russia, but they still have decided to pull out because the the reward didn't outweigh the risks that are involved. So I think companies really do need to evaluate, is it worth staying there, given the fact that that there already are sanctions that are already going to make it difficult for, especially with respect to the sanctions that are now on the banks, it's going to make it very difficult for money and payments to flow in and out of the country. And that was by design. So these sanctions and restrictions are intended to make it very difficult to continue to proceed in operations in Russia.
And I would echo that. I think it's a cost benefit analysis, right? It's going to be increasingly, it already is very difficult to do business now, you know, if you're a US party with Russia. And that's not going to get better anytime soon. And it's a cost benefit analysis. Think about down the road as well, you know, how about aftermarket, after sales services? You know, what do you do with that? Do you want your product out there and not being able to service it? Because you're going to run into the same problem. You're not going to get paid, or you're not going to be able to get paid. You may not be able to deliver services. So it's a really, you know, it's a strategic decision, of course. But right now, you've got to look at the cost and the difficulty with doing business there and collecting on your payments. With you know, what's the advantage? You know, what is the revenue you can bring in?
We have a question that's been raised in the chat. It says, in an optimistic view that there is a breakthrough in negotiations between the combatants, is there precedence to understand the timing for DTTC, BIS, OFAC, etc., to begin rolling back sanctions? So, you know, we're not optimistic that this is going to end quickly, but in the event that it did, what is the sense of timing? Are sanctions quick to come and you know, take quite a while to lift, or can they be lifted as quickly?
Sanctions typically on this scale, they're quick to roll out, but they're not quick to be undone, because the U.S. as well as its allied partners, they are going to want to have a period of time to evaluate, because the last thing they will want to do is to roll back these sanctions and open the market back up to Russia to only see certain promises that would be made to not be carried through. So it would be a period of time for those sanctions to be unwound, but if this is all in an optimistic view, but it wouldn't be it wouldn't be, it took a week or days or hours to see these sanctions come out, and we'll see the sanctions undone within a week. This is not the situation that we saw when, you know, certain sanctions came out against Turkey. They came quick, they went quick. This is completely different. This is a much larger scale. And it's not just the U.S. unilaterally taking this action. This is done in partnership and coordination with our global allied partners. So I would expect that this would take some time, and they're more likely than not, there would be certain benchmarks that would have to be hit before the sanctions would be completely unwound.
And I think one thing to mention there is those agencies are working together. So you talk about DDTC. We've had an arms embargo on Russia for many, many months before, long before this conflict even came about. That's not changing. That's going to stay there for a long time. So if you're thinking ITAR, you're not getting ITAR into Russia, period. So move on from that, you know, and the other two, when you talk about commerce and treasury, they work together. And it takes a long time. Historically, we see it takes a long time for OFAC to react. I think about the Sudan sanctions. You know, Sudan was fully embargoed for many, many years. The emergency was removed several years before the regulations with the sanctions actually were removed from the system. So it takes a while for them to move. When they do move, they'll move quickly to insert them, to put them on, and not so quick to get rid of them. So no, I don't think they're going to fade away quickly, even if the conflict is resolved soon.
Well, we know that time is precious for everybody right now. We're all dealing with many issues still from the pandemic and now this crisis. And so I'm sorry that we're not able to continue the discussion. I think it's a fascinating discussion. It's going to happen. It's going to continue, I think, as we've mentioned, in the weeks and the months ahead. If you have additional questions, if you're on this webinar and you have specific questions, many of these kinds of issues are very fact specific. So feel free to reach out to any of us on the panel. We would love to continue the discussion with you. Apart from the sanctions and the business decisions, we certainly realize that there is a human element here and that our clients have operations in these countries, they have employees, there is a personnel element, and there is this humanitarian crisis. And in closing, we'd just like to extend our heartfelt condolences to those people who are suffering. And they're suffering on both sides of this conflict. We will continue to monitor the situation. We will continue to provide you with the information as it comes available to us. Feel free to reach out. We'd love to continue this dialogue. Otherwise, thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.